Well, good morning. Delighted to be here to follow up such a distinguished speaker, such as Chairman Chatterjee and others here, Governor Inslee and others this morning to discuss such an important topic. And we look forward to discussing this one about what's next for a low-carbon transition. We have a fine panel here to help us with that, beginning here with Alicia Barton, who is the President and CEO of the New York State Research and Development Authority. That's a mouthful.
It is. Just say NYSERDA.
NYSERDA. From here on, it's known as NYSERDA. That is a public agency here in the state that advances innovative energy solutions to improve the state's economy and its environment. Alicia previously held public and private sector leadership roles advancing clean energy projects and companies for more than a decade, including serving as a co-chair of the energy and clean tech practice at the firm Foley Hoag, and chief of operations of the Global Utility Business Unit at SunEdison, and also an executive officer of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We're also delighted to have as well Paul DeBar, who is the Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. Paul is the principal advisor on fundamental energy research, energy technologies, and science at the DOE. He's also the lead at the Agency for Technology Commercialization for the department and for its 17 national laboratories, often considered to be the crown jewels in the research and development infrastructure in the United States. Prior to his confirmation, Paul was a managing director at J.P. Morgan, where he led various energy business areas and had more than $400 billion in investment experience across all energy sectors. Prior to joining J.P. Morgan, Paul was a Navy nuke. He was a nuclear submarine officer based in California and Pearl Harbor, and had some research experience, environmental research experience at the North Pole. And last but not least, we have Kyung Park. She is a managing director and head of environmental markets at Goldman Sachs. There she manages and supports the global environmental initiatives at Goldman with a focus on critical environmental issues. She's oversees the firm's key initiatives, including mobilizing $150 billion in clean energy financing and investment, catalyzing innovative green bonds, expanding ESG and impact investing, and oversees as well a 100% renewable energy procurement topic at the Goldman as well. So where I would like to start is each of you, to one extent or another, has had considerable experience in the development and deployment of low-carbon technologies. What have you learned from that experience, and especially at this time as you anticipate the transition that we're seeing to low-carbon technologies? Alicia?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you and with such a distinguished set of speakers today. And maybe just to put a little bit of background behind the mouthful that is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. We are the lead energy policy agency and the lead energy innovation agency for the state of New York. The NYSERDA has been around since the 1970s, had its roots really in investing in energy R&D for the long term, although we have grown up substantially, particularly in recent years, to a focus on more mature markets and doing things like large-scale renewable energy procurement on behalf of New Yorkers. I think, when I think about that question, it really is interesting to me to think about it's been really a mixed track record for commercialization and advancement of technologies. Some of them have far outpaced or exceeded I would say my own expectations for how fast technology would advance and costs would fall over a certain amount of time period. And I would say, A couple of standout examples. I mean, certainly the global ramp up in solar deployment is sort of a well-known story. But I'd say even in the last, like if you just look at the last 2 years, the cost declines and advancements in technology in offshore wind, for example, are really extraordinary. The machines have gone from 3.5 megawatts to now GE's developing a 12.5 megawatt machine for that's going to go in the water later this year for testing. In again just a few short years, and as a result, the costs have come down really precipitously to a point where we see this as a very cost-effective long-term technology to power the New York State electric grid. Energy storage the same way. What we're seeing in the market right now and the advancements and scale-up of lithium-ion batteries is really I think, again, happened much faster than we thought, even 12 months ago, 24 months ago, 36 months ago. And then on the flip side, you see other technologies that have been around for a while that we keep waiting maybe for that game changer moment to happen, but it just doesn't come necessarily. So it reinforces, I think, to those of us in the business of funding energy innovation and R&D that it is hard to know. It is hard to proverbially pick winners and losers. Because the technology can move very rapidly. It's hard for us as government agencies sometimes also to keep up with the falling costs of technology. And if you're not paying close enough attention, you may be building policies that are not reflective of market condition and market opportunity that has moved quickly. So it reinforces to us sort of an eyes wide open set of challenges, not to prejudge the outcome and to be really focused on watching the markets closely.
Yeah, it's an important point. I think that progress can be very incremental, and perhaps more so than we expect. Paul?
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here back. I went to graduate school here at Columbia. I did want to start by just kind of level setting kind of what the Department of Energy does. It's probably a much misnamed department. It's probably better named the Department of Energy Science and Defense Programs, but that's not really a great name.
People have tried to make that change in the past.
Yeah, it's hard to define the full scope. But the core of the department is the 17 national labs and the 60,000 researchers who work. It is the largest R&D organization in the world. On the non-defense side, we spend about $14 billion a year in R&D. And then on top of that, we do some defense work. And it's generated whole industries such as nuclear medicine, nuclear power, nuclear imaging, the white LED light, MRI, the Human Genome Project, just to kind of deviate from energy. And it's the largest generator of Nobel Prize winners in the world. And so a lot of people don't realize, where, the scope of how the National Lab Complex works and what is contributed over the course of time. So from our point of view, we have a number of different program offices that are really very energy resource specific, so things that you would probably expect. We actually have programs, offices specifically in it. So renewables and efficiency, fossil, nuclear, grid, cybersecurity, and then dealing with chemistry fusion, actually, which is it's no longer 30 years out.
Oh, really?
Which is a whole longer conversation. So just to comment where we kind of see at a high level where some technologies are moving. I think if you go back and look at how technologies, where they were in the energy sector, there was a long time in which there wasn't a lot of incentives to drive energy technologies and efficiencies and turbine heat rates and so on. But about 10 years ago, there was a really big jump, a really big push, and there's a whole series of things that have happened. So just to remind everyone here in the room, so solar all-installed costs have dropped 90% in the last decade. Wind capacity factors, and this is MECI and Aero. It's really hard to move those kind of statistics. They've improved 100% from when I was doing wind earlier on in my career. Oil and gas lifting costs have dropped about 70%. And lithium-ion batteries are now economic to provide utility-scale storage without any incentives and without any mandates. And so there's been some amazing moves in the last decade. in some of these major technologies. And what we see in front of us, and I'll stop here so we can drill into it as appropriate, we see that there's a series of technologies that we are investing dollars in. We focus on things that the private sector does not do, so incremental improvements in wind turbine factors we don't focus on, but major jumps in things such as different chemistries beyond lithium ion, which would have a major jump in how electric vehicles could have performance, or personal electronics or utilities. That's where we really focus on.
Interesting. Young.
Yeah, so I want to also level set, because you were very generous in your introduction by saying that I help manage a lot of what Bill said, but at the core of this is these are initiatives that are very much embedded within each and every one of our businesses, and our clients are looking for it, and the market's actually, there's a significant market opportunity around it, and hence, why this is very much at the core of what we do across our businesses. Just in terms of bringing this conversation together, and many of the points I completely agree with, let me make a few observations of things that we've seen in the market, having done this now for 12 years. So first of all, we talked about this in the back of the stage. Many of these technologies in some ways have been around, right? Solar's been around for over a century, the very early stages of solar, EV2, right, for decades. And it's been very incremental in many ways, but then you hit an inflection point, and then the pace of change is incredibly dramatic. And Alicia mentioned it's way faster than any market projection. And you're seeing that play out. Certainly we saw this with LED, one of the fastest tech shifts on record, and we're seeing this play out with solar, wind, and even EV and storage in many ways, right? And the interesting thing about low carbon technologies is that, unlike conventional energy, there's a virtuous cycle at work. The more you use and deploy, the cheaper it becomes, and it continues to accelerate. The second observation is that it's not just about low carbon technologies, right? It's the convergence of all these technologies coming together, what many coined the fourth industrial revolution, where you have everything from AI, machine learning, even blockchain, all the way through advanced materials that are converging. And when you think about the energy model, it's fundamentally changing not only to low carbon, but blockchain is starting to, and NYSERDA was at the heart of this in many ways, where blockchain is now enabling secure transactions between consumers and enabling them to become prosumers of energy. You're seeing digitalization in smart grids and connected homes and devices now optimizing and enabling consumers to make smarter, more efficient choices, right? And that's a very powerful change. And this is happening in almost every industry, factory floors, ag and food, in our cities. And if we can harness this in a very effective way, it's actually going to drive much more sustainable growth models and a way for us to actually drive a low carbon and a more efficient transition. The last point that I will make, because we often get this question, is that there's actually been ample capital around this agenda. And there's more capital that actually wants to invest in sustainable low carbon solution sets. The challenge has always come down to the economics and the risk-reward equation. And again, coming back to solar and wind is a really powerful example of how economics can unlock capital. So in the early days of solar and wind, when it was more expensive relative to conventional energy, we needed a lot of policy support, DOE loan guarantee programs, all the way to tax incentives, and in other global countries there were feed-in tariffs. But now that we're actually in a market where it's more economic in many ways, it's scaled and it's growing way faster, we have a whole lot of tools at our disposal, whether it's public market instruments like green bonds you mentioned in the intro, securitization to convertible hybrid instruments. And in the private market, you have a whole range of investors coming in. Institutional investors, some of the most conservative like insurance companies and public pension funds that like to get long-term coupons, really hungry to actually invest into these opportunity sets. You have strategics and companies, not only your traditional utilities, but now big oil and gas companies looking for electron growth, right? Making investments. And even tech companies now trying to get into some of the consumer engagement platforms and making strategic bets and acquisitions. It's an incredibly disruptive and exciting time in many ways.
Well, Kelly, you mentioned policy, and how has, and a question to all of you, how has government policy enabled the development and deployment of low-carbon technologies? at the federal and state level. And how has it gotten in the way?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the early innings of solar and wind as an example, policy plays an outsized role, right, in terms of trying to, ensure that the right risk-return equation works, because you're ultimately competing with conventional energy solutions that have been around for well over a century, and in many ways have benefited. I think that in the early emerging market conversation, there was a lot of conversation around fossil fuel, and the affordability of renewable energy. And it was acknowledged that there are a lot of fossil subsidies that still remain, not only in developing countries, but in the US we have tax credits, right? And so government policy plays an incredibly important role. I think also in the early stage technologies where we need a lot of innovation and disruption, private sector is not well equipped to really invest in R&D, particularly the energy industry, right? Because the costs are very significant. The benefits are very diffuse, and so government absolutely, both at the state and at the federal level, play an incredibly important role. And one of the other things that we can't forget is there's a lot that has to come around this ecosystem, right? Whether it's grid integration or the digitalization of grid. And I missed, unfortunately, the FERC commissioner because we're behind the scenes there. But again, I think government, in many ways, has to play a holistic role in all of that, right? And lastly, I think state today plays perhaps even a bigger role in terms of providing demand visibility, whether it's renewable portfolio standards or zero emissions vehicle mandates, buildings where there's market barriers and a lot of inertia, right? And providing building codes and energy efficiency performance requirements, and the role of NYSERDA. In terms of driving innovation. So absolutely, state and federal policy in many ways are very important. Yeah. But one last point that I make is, by default, many of our policies tend to look backwards, right? It's really hard to look forward given the pace of change that is underway. And I think it's very important where we can to lean in and look forward and enable flexible policy mechanisms so that markets can continue to innovate. And I'm sure Alicia will have a lot to say about that, given the New York State efforts underway.
Alicia.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in there. I think one of the interesting points that you make, and that I feel strongly has been part of, what has allowed a lot of progress to be made again, is the role that government plays in advancing R&D. And I know Paul will speak to that from the federal perspective. And again, I think there's, without a doubt, I think everyone would recognize a real role for the government for early stage R&D that the private sector is not well equipped to make investments on. The government sector is also very uniquely situated many times in that space to play a convening role, to bring together R&D consortium where certain technologies are pre-competitive for any particular industry player. And we've seen that DOE has a long track record of funding those consortium. NYSERDA has partnered with DOE on a number of them, including one right now that DOE and NYSERDA are partnering on for the offshore wind industry that I'm very excited about. But there is also the tie-in for the market pull, and you mentioned, our states RPS, and I do think that to the degree that government has and government policy has done something very positive, it is sending those long-term market signals that tend to drive investor confidence that the market will be there by putting in place, for example, these type of RPS, or in the case of New York State, clean energy standard requirements. We, a couple years ago, put in place a clean energy standard to say 50% renewable energy by 2030. That's what the state's electricity supply will need to be. We will allocate that obligation to all load-serving entities in the state of New York, and NYSERDA will run procurements to help bring those resources into the market. And what we saw, and we were ambitious when we put that in place, but what we saw was we went into our first RFP under the clean energy standard and ended up procuring twice as much new renewable energy that we intended to because the prices were so good. We went back the next year, and again, we had also set a predictable procurement schedule so that the market could see that those opportunities were going to be there. And for example, if a certain project wasn't ready for that first RFP, there was a motivation to keep investing in that project nonetheless because they knew the next RFP was going to be there a year later. And again, we ended up procuring in the second RFP twice as much large-scale renewable energy as we intended to. Collectively, both of those procurements came in at 25% lower cost than we had predicted just back in 2016. So again, we have been seeing that positive signal to the market. The converse of that is where we've had mixed signals to the market, and you put policies in place and then repeal them. We've seen that in a number of states, including the state where I used to live and work in Massachusetts, where, for example, a net metering policy to stimulate distributed solar development had a cap on it. The cap would frequently be subscribed. The whole market would stop. Companies literally would be building projects, building their pipeline, hiring staff. Oh, we've hit the net metering cap. Now we have to lay people off, go to the next cap. And that start and stop can be very disruptive. Right. And that's been a part of the strategy here in New York to try to move to longer term market incentives with longer term visibility runway. Right. Before we hear from Paul, you make a good point, and continuity is important. Questions from the audience, please. You can use social media to look for Columbia U Energy. And if you have a question, type it out and we'll try to get to it. Paul, where do you draw the line when it comes to public policy?
Well, I'm going to approach this from a very free market and a technology R&D business point of view. So I'll just kind of put that into kind of a caveat. I think from our perspective, we think that technology innovation is far more enduring than specific government policies or tax incentives. Those things change back and forth, and structures change, and markets, these people get whipsawed back and forth. But what's enduring is innovation. And that's what we've seen. We talked about it earlier in terms of massive innovation that's happened. And if you actually take a look at some of the technologies now, they're completely economic. So solar and batteries and wind and batteries are in many areas of the countries, depending on the node, are actually without any incentives, without any mandates, are completely economic to gas. And by the way, gas has gotten way more efficient, has had a lot less emissions, and is way cheaper because of innovation. And so, from our point of view, we focus dollars on very large amounts of R&D across the board and try to see where researchers at Brookhaven or the dollars we spend across the university system at MIT and Caltech and what they come up with, and let the entrepreneurialism of researchers drive that. So when I think about public policy within that context is, how much capital should we be applying to those particular areas, and where do we allocate the capital? And one of the things I like to describe to a business audience is, so what do you do, right? What's your job? My job is really two things, is to run operations and it's to allocate capital. Running operations is running a large lab complex. Allocating capital is figuring out of the large amount of money that the federal government through Congress appropriations gives us about what's the next thing coming up and where should we allocate the capital that will make the most difference. And so what I find really interesting, and a lot of people don't notice this, watching television gives you a really distorted view about, I think, what really happens, certainly in Washington. But I was testifying before the Senate E&R committee here a couple of months ago about innovation. I was sitting next to Ernie Moniz. There was great cross-administration collaboration, frankly, between ourselves and the previous administrations about innovation and where we invest and so on. And you had both sides of the senators getting up and saying, we know that we could come up with bipartisan support about how we can drive things forward, but we know that the press sitting here in the room will actually not report on this, and they did not, right? Because they don't like to talk about senators sitting in a hearing room saying, we actually have some bipartisan about how to actually attack these things. That's not newsworthy. But one of the things I think is what happened this last year. The innovation dollars that got spent for the National Lab Complex went up 25%. Most people have no idea that the U.S. federal support for R&D through all these areas that we're lucky to cover just went up to an all-time high and through the roof. And it was widely bipartisan as it passed through the House and the Senate. And I expect that there's various proposals, and where's the common denominator, right? There's lots of people around public policy issues, around mandates or taxes, but where they're heading And there's people across the political spectrum who actually have a commonality that, depending on what they want to try to accomplish, one of the commonalities that they ran into last year, and I think they may run into again this year, is that the commonality of accomplishing whatever various people want to support is on innovation. Whether you're from Texas or you're from Massachusetts or whatever, you can go like, well, how do I accomplish the goals that people are talking about? Innovation and new technology is a commonality. That's why there was a giant increase in support of that this last year. And that's why I expect that there's momentum for that this year.
But the view of innovation differs, right, from one person to the next, from one politician to the next, from one policymaker to the next, right?
I think less than what some people may say. Mm-hmm. There was a letter sent to the Appropriations Committee, testified before the Appropriations Committee, about the importance in investing in innovation, kind of broad stroke. And 160 House members signed the letter. And there were people from oil and gas representatives from West Texas, and a certain representative from Brooklyn and the Bronx signed it. And so it was everybody, right, who signed this. And that's why I think that there really is actually more commonalities to this than some people say. And once again, from our perspective, when you think about building a coalition for innovation, we support innovation across the board. Once again, seeing where innovators and entrepreneurs in the R&D system come up with ideas, and then let her drive forward. So there's been amazing jumps in oil and gas production, which has actually improved emissions and efficiency, as well as solar, as well as fusion, as well as in batteries. And I think in general, there's a wide consensus for continuing to do that and increasing it.
Yeah.
If I may jump in,
Yeah,
I would certainly second the endorsement of bipartisan support for innovation. And we know, right, it has been a powerful force for the American economy, over decades. It is what the U.S. does well, and people see that, and that's why, part of why we see so much excitement around clean energy technologies in particular, I think, is because of the powerful economic benefits that it is bringing along with it. And again, that is bipartisan. You see support for, wind energy, for example, in lots of parts of the United States that are not known as particularly left-leaning or democratic, but because, again, it's been a tremendous technology that has delivered, benefits to the electric grid and to the local economy. I will say, though, the flip side of that, certainly different administrations and different policymakers will make choices about where to allocate capital, as Paul said. And for us in New York, we are committed to combating climate change and meeting that as the crisis and existential threat that it is. We take that very seriously, and we are allocating capital to technologies that are aligned with the need to address that crisis urgently. And I would also argue, with the growing consensus around that is shared by, I believe, the global community, that there will be a hard conversation to come about continuing to advance innovation in industries that may or may not have a future home in the technology space as we have to migrate to lower carbon technologies. Now, that's not a simple, binary, that means no fossil fuels of any kind. Certainly there are investments in nuclear technology, as you mentioned, in carbon capture technologies that may allow different permutations to take place. But I'd be remiss if I didn't state clearly, the intention for us really is to harness innovation and our investments in that direction.
Can I just add one quick point, actually, which I think is also important for us to recognize? Totally agree on innovation, and we absolutely need to, put a lot more muscle behind it, because obviously other countries are also innovating, particularly in China. But one of the other things that we also have to be very mindful of is the interaction of different policies and unintended consequences, right? So in many ways, I agree with Paul that, solar and wind, now the market forces are by far the biggest driver behind it, but policy does matter. And where we've seen this, for example, is when there was tax reform, right? The value of tax credits became less clear, at least for that near-term period until things became more visible. And then things like trade, challenges, right? With solar tariffs, for example, also put an overhang in the market. Now, the market's overcoming that, but the interaction of all these policies are incredibly complex, and we just can't underestimate how we think about these things and need to take a much more progressive and holistic view to these things.
Well, I want to jump right to some questions from the audience because we have some very good ones here. And this is for all three panelists. Given the great difficulty of choosing technological winners, why isn't the right answer to put a price on carbon and then let the market sort out winners and losers? Paul?
Well, once again, I'm going to come back to free markets and technology. I think the market already, for frankly some of the reasons that are being discussed here, around market pull associated with these topics. And once again, what we've been spending money on research, and the university system across this, as well as in the private sector, has been spending a lot of money on this already based on the things that were just discussed. So let me give you something. This gets into large computer modeling and going through materials, and I have a long list of things that are really can really have a major change. But I'll give you one example of it on this particular topic. Developing a material, basically a film like a baghouse is used for fly ash or so on. We do computer modeling at one of our national labs to take a look at materials that basically can screen out carbon dioxide. And basically it's a filter, and you can collect it on the other side and pipe it off. That's simple, right? As simple as a baghouse. And based on our modeling and then going actually to the labs, we think, and I want to give this as a big caveat, because this is research, and research is like, it doesn't happen until it's done. But, we may have some materials that are $40 a ton carbon capture screening, very simple screening. When I ask the people, who are doing the research on this, I go, how far do you think these materials can be pushed? And this is where they start getting really nervous because you're asking researchers to predict what they're going to be able to uncover in the future. But they said, maybe we can cut that by half. So when you start thinking about that, and I'm not saying that's going to happen, it's far better than what $100 a ton that people are talking about. But if you're talking about 40 or 20, you're actually now reaching a point in which, actually I think the market pull, right, of what people are willing to pay versus mandates and taxes may not be necessary. And, once again, the enduring part of the market pull, I think, is far better than public policy. It's an opinion, right? It's a free market opinion. Enduring technology changes can make a real difference, and it is making a difference because I see it when I go to labs and they show me what they're doing.
And the perception of policy matters too. I mean, clearly this administration has taken a different view in the overarching issue when it comes to energy or clean energy policy in terms of climate change. But you do see that as an obstacle in terms of promoting.
I can tell you that what's happening with AI for building management, AI for grid management, we got 3 different private fusion companies to building their first commercial fusion plant. The carbon capture materials I just mentioned, beyond lithium-ion chemistries that could have performance at 3 to 5 times current lithium-ion. Imagine a car with a range of 3 to 5 times right now. So if you stop and think about those things, that's actually in the pipeline, right? Those are possibilities. And so I think, when you work in the world of tech, it's hard to get anything but horribly optimistic. But it's real, yeah. Right? We're funding it. It's happening. And the possibilities are really there.
Yeah.
Sorry,
please.
I was just going to say, though, I think it depends on the perspective of how you look at that question, right? If we're talking about climate change, right, we've got to do more and we've got to do a lot faster. And so we need all the tools at our disposal. And so to me, it's not an either-or question. In many ways, we do need a pricing signal on the externality. However, that's not going to solve, it's not the silver bullet by far, right? Because when you think about the practical realities of how carbon prices have materialized in other countries or regions, because of the political challenge, it's never strong enough, right? And in some places like Australia, for example, you had it, and then it obviously got pulled back again. And so the point about a lot of these are very capital intensive with long paybacks, and you need to have that long-term certainty around it, right? And there are inevitably going to be places where you are still going to have market barriers, right? Whether it's energy efficiency or big conservation requirements or R&D, where you're going to need complementary policies around it. And so I think we have to get real about the practicality of how these things work and what is the actual end goal that we're really looking to achieve.
Well, see, I would disagree, because right now, if you look at solar and batteries and wind and batteries, they're completely pari passu with gas. And so,
driven by RPS policies that allowed those markets to scale substantially and bring the cost down through things like soft cost reduction in addition to the technology advancement. I absolutely share your optimism and enthusiasm for the pace of innovation. And those examples you gave are extremely exciting. $20 per ton of carbon is, I mean, that's a radical game changer by all means. But we frankly don't have the luxury of time, and we do need to take account of the externalities, as you said, and so the carbon tax may be one way to do that, but I think there are other mechanisms like the RPS or the Clean Energy Standard that have been very effective, and I think the proof is exactly as you just said, where you see cost parity in some of these places. All of that has come to bear to enable that to be a reality.
Here's another question from the audience. Are all the main technologies that will drive the low-carbon transition known and in place? Or are there any dark horses out there that will make a difference, a big difference in the future, that aren't visible players today?
You probably have the best insight to that from what's happening in the labs.
To say that we're even close to defining what's possible in the universe is far. I mean, that's completely a non-possibility. I mean, we spent a lot of time identifying, trying to identify different types of dark matter and dark energy, and we just got the picture of for the first time what a black hole looks like today. And so there's so much to learn about the universe and how things work. There will always be those. So the question is what's kind of on the horizon, right? And I do think storage and chemistries that are beyond lithium ion, I think are a potential major jump that are out there. In Brookhaven, we work a lot with New York State on this. We appreciate all our work with New York State on this, amongst others. But there are, as I mentioned, a dark horse. We have three private fusion companies looking to build our first power prototype. Two of them are looking to site it at one of our labs for their first power prototype, and it's within the realm of being economic.
Right.
And so it's still a ways off, and and so on, but. If we can make power from water and it's emission free and it's cost competitive,
and it's not 30 years off,
and it's not 30 years off anymore. So
we got about a minute left to hear from Alicia and Kyung on this last question.
Well, I'll give you an example of a dark horse. We actually made an investment in a company in Japan that is actually making paper from limestone. So you're not going to need forest, you're not going to need water. Right? And when you think about low carbon and the transition that we need, if we move outside of energy, right, land use change is a very big challenge, and deforestation is by far one of the biggest drivers, and actually one of the cheapest ways of meeting some of our carbon sequestration reduction requirements. And so if you can actually reduce deforestation and also incentivize better conservation, I think that's incredibly powerful. One of our research analysts actually recently did a piece on silicon carbide. It's a material that actually was discovered 4.6 billion years ago in meteorites. And now it's actually getting harnessed to replace silicon, and that's going to dramatically improve performance as well as cost. And so there's all these hidden gems in many ways that's going to transform things.
Alicia, a quick rejoinder?
Well, I can't outdo Paul on what the exciting advancements that are coming out of the national labs, and all I can say is we need all of it as fast as possible, and it's really exciting that that we do have so many advancements, and to see the increase in the budget that Paul referred to is incredibly important alongside the investments that states are making, and that is sort of the reason to be optimistic in the conversation.
A lot to keep an eye on from a technology, investment, and a policy standpoint. I'd like to thank this panel for their insights on this today.